webinar brought to you by Advanced Workplace Strategies, or AWSI. AWSI offers a complete package of employee and applicant screening services, including drug and alcohol testing, background checks, and other key verification and assessment services. As a partner of U.S. and internationally based companies in a wide variety of industries for over 25 years, AWSI exceeds expectations by offering innovative services, to customer support, and a personalized approach to meet clients' research, investigative, and background check needs. Today is entitled The Negative Impact of Legalized Marijuana on the Workplace and What You Can Do About It, and will be presented by Bill Current of the Current Consulting Group. Bill is the president and founding partner of the Current Consulting Group and publisher of the online Ultimate Guide to State Drug Testing Laws at statedrugtestinglaws.com. The author of 10 books on substance-related issues, including the popular title, What Testing. He is a leading provider of drug testing policy and services and works with companies to help them optimize their drug testing ROI. He also administers the annual Drug Testing Industry Survey in the United States, now in its 17th year. It will be a pleasure to hear from Bill Current.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and welcome to everyone who is on today's webinar. I want to begin by thanking AWSI for sponsoring this webinar and for the webinar series that they have done here in 2015. And we've had been associated with AWSI on their webinar series this year on a number of occasions, and it's really important to bring this kind of information to drug testing providers and their clients to make sure that we're sort of all on the same page when it comes to how we put our programs together, how we address key issues in the industry like the legalization of marijuana. And so kudos to AWSI for being willing to do that and providing this valuable service. We're going to talk marijuana today, and we've got a lot of people on today's call. It continues to be one of the topics in the drug testing industry, both for providers of drug testing services and for those who purchase and buy drug testing services. I think 2016 is going to be even just times 10. As we head into a presidential election year, you're going to see legalization of marijuana on ballots all over the country. And from a political standpoint, the two parties will use it as a way to try to get their voters to the polls on election day. But place the whole country in a position where we're going to be deciding in perhaps a record number of states whether marijuana should be legalized for medicinal purposes and or for recreational purposes. And so this is a timely topic, and it's going to be even hotter in 2016. So we'll probably hear a lot more of the same. As of now, though, there are about 24 states, that's including D.C., so 23 states plus the District of Columbia that have legalized marijuana either for medical or recreational use. Legalization efforts are well funded, they're well organized, are active throughout the entire country, even in states where marijuana has already been legalized. The legalization folks are there trying to agenda even further. Now, I've been accused in the past, because I've done a lot of webinars and conference addresses on this issue, and I've been accused in the past of sort of biased one way or the other, and I am biased in terms of my opinion on marijuana legalization. I'll try not to sprinkle this presentation with too much of my own opinion. But I talk about the impact of marijuana, the magnitude of the problem, its direct effect on the workplace and on society, and then from an employer's standpoint, what you can do and what you must do. You have a responsibility and perhaps even a legal obligation to do to continue to address the problem. So we're going to go through all of those issues in this presentation today, and I invite you to put your question in the Q&A section of the screen in front of you. We will try to get to all the questions we can. If you've heard me give a presentation on the marijuana issue in the past, I've included a lot of new information today. You will access to these slides. AWSI will make these slides available to you. That's a value-added service of coming to the AWSI-sponsored webinar today. And you'll also get the recording of today's webinar. But if you have questions, please hit them. Even if it's something that's not covered in my presentation in terms of the state laws that we're going to we're going to talk about any details, etc., let me know, and we'll try to answer your questions and get responses to you. Now, this is a book by Bill Bent and Robert White. I'm not associated with it anyway. I don't get commissions off the sale of this book, but I purchased it, I read it, and I find it to be very informative. It's a fascinating look at the whole issue. If you're into this and you get a lot of good information that can help you put together your company position or to sort of reinforce perhaps what your company position should be, this is a great book to get. I highly recommend it. Let's dive into the marijuana issue from a sort of magnitude of the problem perspective as a way of sort of set the table for the discussion of the legalization of marijuana. And let me put in front of you a number, 27 million. Now, if we were in a room together, I would ask you, what do you think this number means? And some of you would probably get it right. This is the number of current illegal users in the United States, according to an annual study that comes out from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration every year from SAMHSA. 20 million Americans, as part of that survey, had used an illicit drug at least one time in the just prior to being a participant in that survey. That's over 10% of the U.S. population 12 and older. Of the more than 2 million current illicit drug users who were 18 or older, near percent of them were employed full or part-time, and of 18 and older who were unemployed who participated in the survey, up to 18% admitted to being current illicit drug users. Now, current illicit drug user, as I mentioned, is who admits to using an illicit drug at least one time in the last 30 days. This includes people who say that they're past year users, meaning they've used an illicit drug at least once in the last 12 months. These percentages and these numbers go up much higher if you expand to beyond 30 days to the last 12 months. Just for point of comparison, there's a study done several years ago on the National Survey on Drug Use and Health to how accurate these results are from year to year. Because the government's been doing this study under different names since the 1970s. It used to be called the Household Survey on Drug Use. The study, if you will, determined these results are about 1/3 less than they are. In other words, people were presented with the opportunity to talk about their illegal drug use with a representative of the federal government conducting a survey on the telephone, will, not surprisingly, lie. And these numbers are perhaps as much as 1/3 lower than what they really are in the States. So that 27 million is actually higher than 27 million. And that 2 million is higher than 22 million. This work with, but and scary enough as it is, but it may be lowballing the magnitude of the problem from a statistical perspective. Now here's another number for you, 22.2 million. And that's up 19.8 million in just 1 year's time. 22.2 million in current users of marijuana. That's 0.4% of the U.S. population 12 and older, and that's up almost a full percentage point from this year. It's almost unheard of for these numbers to move that dramatically in such a period of time. From nearly 20 million, 19.8 I think it was, to 22.2 million in one time in drug category, marijuana. Now, as you can see on the screen, the other categories of drug abuse are scary enough, but they don't even come close to comparing to marijuana. Prescription drugs, all the sedatives, tranquilizers, antidepressants, etc., combined together is 5 million, cocaine 1.5 million, hallucinogens 1.2 million, and stimulants and heroin at about 500,000. Some of those, in the case of heroin, up a little bit. Prescription drugs up a little bit overall. Actually, no, I take that back. Prescription drugs down just a little bit as a category, but up in certain subcategories like tranquilizers and sedatives. But up significantly. In fact, as you go into the National Survey on Drug Use and Health report, and there's the URL there at the bottom of the screen. When you get these slides, you'll be able to just cut that and put it into a Google search, and you'll be able to get right to the PDF of this report. But it says in the report, the illicit drug use estimate for 2014 continues to be driven primarily by marijuana use and the use of prescription pain relievers. The people who were current illicit drug users in 2014 than in prior years appears to reflect trends in marijuana use. In the graph, this rise in marijuana use among those aged 12 or older reflects the increase in marijuana use by adults aged 26 or older. So the increase in drug abuse overall taking place in the United States, and it clearly seems driven by a dramatic increase in marijuana use throughout the country. In results of the General Social Survey came out. This is a survey that comes out of the University of Chicago. For the first time since the survey first asked the question in 1975, a majority of Americans supported legal marijuana in 2014. 52% compared to 42% who thought it should remain illegal. That's a direct quote of the survey. That's a jump in support for legalizing the drug since 2012, when only 43% said they were in favor. 25 years ago, 1990, just 16% supported legalizing marijuana, according to the General Social Survey. So there's been a dramatic shift in the attitude and the perspective of Americans toward the issue of legalizing marijuana, and it's a dramatic shift that has taken place very recently. It is a drop in the perception of harm associated with the use of marijuana by high school students. This is that comes out. This is a Caesar fact from the University of Maryland. Again, you see the source of it there at the bottom of the page. High school students' perception of risk associated with occasional marijuana use declined from 25% in 2010 to just 16% last year in 2014. And the perceived risk of harm associated with the use of synthetic cannabinoids like K2 and spice, the synthetic marijuana, goes from 33% to 39% from 2014. So and this is one of the phenomenons, one of the trends that we predicted, which is that as marijuana becomes legal and its use increases dramatically, which we're seeing that happen, the use of and the perceived risk of the use of synthetic marijuana would drop, and the risk of harm would go up. And so, one bad is leading to one good, perhaps, even though there's an unacceptable number of people who are still using marijuana. We know this from a number of different reports that there are people who will game the system in their companies. For example, when they know they're going to be subjected to a drug test, they'll switch from real marijuana to fake marijuana until the drug test period that they're anticipating passes, and they'll switch back to real marijuana. So synthetic cannabinoids is a replacement for real dope until the perceived testing period passes. So the two are sort of working in conjunction with one another, and users are using the one to have to not without the high that they get from using real marijuana by using fake marijuana. And the impact on the workplace is well, it's well documented. I didn't bother to put a lot of the stats into this, but some of you know I've written a number of books on the statistics associated with drug abuse and drug abuse in the workplace and drug testing in particular. Jessica mentioned a book I wrote called Why Drug Testing. I have a lot of those stats in this book. They just don't change. I mean, some statistics like the level of abuse of a particular drug among a certain classification of people, that will change from year to year or from a few years to a few years. But the impact or the effect of a drug on individuals doesn't change unless the drug itself changes dramatically. But people under the influence of marijuana, for example, are just less liable, and they have proven to be less safe workers in the workplace. There are a number of studies that have shown this over many, many years. In fact, I asked the question recently giving a presentation at a conference in Oregon about statistics, and it's interesting because while there are some things coming out, the federal government, which used to pour millions of dollars into studying this issue and funding research projects, have there are very few of those kinds of funded projects anymore, research projects out there. Maybe a shift in the policies that some of these federal agencies use, but it's really the result of the fact that some of these things don't need to be studied again. Somebody under the influence of marijuana is less operating heavy machinery, a car, a plane, etc. Somebody who's not under the influence of marijuana, given all the other factors being equal. So know the impact that marijuana has on the workplace. However, the increased use of marijuana, which is tied to the legalization movement, is seeing more workers being at work under the influence of marijuana. Quest Diagnostics, one of the major laboratories in our industry, puts out a report every year called the Drug Testing Index, and tests for marijuana in the workplace increased from 2012 to 2013 by 6.2%. However, in Colorado and Washington, in the year after those two states voted to legalize marijuana for use at all, not just medicinal use, but what we call recreational use, positive marijuana test results increased 20% in Colorado and 3% in Washington. We can expect to see the same type of increases in Oregon and Alaska. Two states have also voted to legalize marijuana. Now, the argument, sort of the basis of the whole legalization argument, is that marijuana is just like alcohol, and alcohol is legal, so why shouldn't marijuana be legal? Well, it's in some ways marijuana is a lot like alcohol, just not in any good ways. You know, the old adage, two wrongs don't make a right, is really true when it comes to that argument that a lot like alcohol is legal, therefore marijuana should be legal. Marijuana is, when you add alcohol to the list, marijuana is the number two substance of abuse in America, alcohol being number one. But marijuana is addictive just like alcohol. It impairs a person's ability to operate heavy machinery, cars, planes, trains, etc., just like alcohol does. It's harm to the human brain, and there are some very compelling studies that bear out just alcohol does, and some accidents in the workplace and on the roads. I don't know if you're familiar with this. This is a study that came out that was revealed last year. It covered a period of 1999 to 2010, so about a 10-year period of time. There was a study based on crash statistics from 6 states, California, Hawaii, Illinois, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and West Virginia, that performed toxicology tests on drivers involved in fatal car wrecks. Now, you know, of those 6 states that I listed there, 5 of them are in what I call marijuana green. That's because marijuana is legal for medicinal use in all 5 of those states. Interesting to note that, as you see at the bottom, quote, alcohol contributed to about the same percentage of traffic fatalities throughout the decade that was studied, 1999 to 2010, about 40%, according to the researchers. But increasingly prevalent role in fatal crashes, the researchers found, drug driving accounted for more than 28% of traffic deaths in 2010, up from just 16% in 1999. Marijuana proved to be the main drug involved in the increase, contributing to 12% of 2010 crashes compared to 4% in 1999. It tripled. Marijuana, THC-related traffic fatalities tripled in a period of time in 6 states, 5 of which have legalized marijuana. And at different points in a 10-year period, marijuana wasn't legal for medicinal purposes in some of these green states here. So we can only anticipate the percentage is going to increase. In other words, the number of people involved in THC-related traffic fatalities is probably just going to go up. And you'll notice that we don't have data from Colorado and Washington, let alone Oregon and Alaska. So this is not good news. It's another way in which marijuana and alcohol are very similar to one another. Now, something that's very disturbing when it comes to, you know, what should your position as an employer or as somebody that provides services to employers should it be when it comes to the marijuana issue? The potency of marijuana today has increased significantly. According to NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, the potent marijuana today has risen by a factor of 3 over the last 30 years. And that's significant. A factor of 3 is significant. Studies that potency values in today's marijuana, THC, the psychoactive ingredient of marijuana, decades ago, it was typically in the 10% or less category. And then, quote the study, as far as potency goes, it's been surprising how strong a lot of marijuana is today, according to the study. Higher THC content is considered to be responsible for the rise of marijuana-related emergency room visits, psychotic behavior, damage to the brain, etc., and probably, as we saw in the previous slide, THC-related traffic fatalities. Now, diol or CBD in marijuana. This is the component in marijuana that researchers or some researchers believe helps treat the different illnesses that people cite when arguing in favor of medicinal marijuana. Things like schizophrenia, Huntington's disease, Alzheimer's disease, and other types of brain and mood disorders. That's what they believe, that cannabidiol or CBD is the component in marijuana that helps to offset the conditions of some of those diseases and conditions. However, according to a study, and you see the source there at the bottom of the page, this was reported in Forbes magazine earlier this year, the cannabidiol levels are decreasing at the time that the THC levels, the potency, is increasing, which means that on a sort of national basis, as you average it out, the high that somebody gets, which is determined by the THC content, isn't going to change from one to another all that much. But the medicinal effect that some people believe comes from smoking, using marijuana or THC-related products of marijuana, and what experts believe and what some users hope for in using marijuana, just simply is not going to be there, because the cannabidiol levels are decreasing, have been decreasing over time, and the potencies have been increasing at the same time. It was done, a survey actually, Employee Screen IQ did a survey of about 500 employers, and they asked, what would reaction be if marijuana was legalized in the states where you do business? 54% would continue their drug testing programs. 20% weren't doing drug testing to begin with. 20% said they would ignore positive test results for marijuana. That's not only stupid, it's legally dangerous. 2% would discontinue drug testing altogether. Now, if you're familiar with our company, the Current Consulting Group, we do a survey of the drug testing industry every year. We've done it now for 17 consecutive years, and we have different questions. And over the last few years, we've added these questions about legalized marijuana. So, impact would legalized marijuana have on the drug testing industry? So, this is a survey of drug testing providers, labs, third-party administrators, medical officers, collectors, etc. And we put these statements in front, and we ask them to mark whether or not they agree with the statement. Little or no impact on drug testing sales. 27% agree with that statement. There's been no impact on drug testing sales yet, but I believe there will be. 21%. Here's where it gets scary. And they're confused and worried how to deal with marijuana in the workplace. Nearly 68% of drug testing providers agree with that statement. Some have already eliminated marijuana from the drug test panel. 17%, 16.9% agreed with that statement. Legal marijuana could potentially harm the drug testing industry significantly, almost 20%. But look at two bolded statements. Employers are confused, and they are worried about how to deal with legal marijuana in the workplace. Do they still have the right to drug test for marijuana? And if somebody tests positive, what can they do? Do they have any rights to take any kind of adverse action against a registered medical marijuana user who tests positive in a workplace drug test? As a result, a disturbing number of drug testing providers who participated in our survey say have already had employers, clients that have eliminated marijuana from the drug test panel. That is a very dangerous thing to do. It goes back to the statement on the previous slide. If you look at the third one down, 12% said they would test for marijuana apparently, but ignore positive results for marijuana. That's dangerous and not wise. And eliminating marijuana from your drug test panel is also perhaps not a very wise thing to do. I'm issues in not this section that's coming up, but in the next section when we talk specifically about how to deal with this issue in your drug test policy. Whether you're advising a company or whether you're an employer on the line today, we'll deal with that in detail here in a second. But I just set the table by reviewing again with you which states legalize marijuana? Colorado, Washington, Oregon, Alaska. Bullet, Ohio? No. As you may all know, last week, Iowans voted not to legalize marijuana. There was a lot of controversy about the particular bill they were asked to vote on. A big number voted against legalizing marijuana for recreational use in Ohio. As you can, the pro-marijuana people have vowed to come back with this initiative and get on the ballot for 2016. I'm still be on the ballot next year. It may grow in support if they clarify exactly what they mean. There was a lot of controversy on monopolizing who can grow marijuana and sell it in the state, and I think a lot of people objected to that. So that was in favor of the folks who were against legalizing marijuana. Now, you know, I have in parentheses the District of Columbia. Yes, in D.C., voters voted to legalize marijuana. There's controversy because laws in the District of Columbia must be approved by the U.S. Congress. And so there's been a back and forth on that, of course, and the city council there in D.C. has rebelled against Congress on this issue. But let's clear about something. What they voted to do in D.C. is not the same as what they voted to do in Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska. In the District of Columbia, essentially what they voted to legalize was the use of marijuana, but not the sale or the cultivation of marijuana. So technically, even though the city council there has defied Congress and said you can smoke dope inside the District of Columbia if you want to legally, they did create a legal marketplace for marijuana within the district. So it remains illegal to sell marijuana, like always. And the source to get the marijuana that you can now use legally is on the black market, so to speak. And so it's still buying dope from your local drug dealer. And if you get caught buying it, if you're selling it, it's still against the law there. So same as the other the 4 states there, they were looking at doing in Ohio either. They have in common, well, they had already legalized marijuana for medicinal purposes. And they were part of this growing list of states that have legalized marijuana for medicinal purposes. This is the fertile battleground in the effort to legalize marijuana throughout the country. These are the states where you're seeing legislation introduced, initiatives placed on ballots for voters to consider to legalize marijuana for recreational use, because they've already brought down the barriers against legalization a little bit on. Now, these are states that in some cases that you would typically not see on this list, but some of them, it's surprising it took them this long to get to it. These states where some experts, like Ethan Nadelman from the Drug Policy Alliance, predicts that marijuana will be legalized in the near future. And I'm talking about for recreational use. California, Nevada, Massachusetts, and probably Arizona. California is expected to be legalized marijuana for recreational use. Probably by that. Now, the intent of these laws is to decrease the use of marijuana by individuals with serious debilitating illnesses. Okay, California, and this is not common to see this in different state medical marijuana laws. It removes criminal penalties. I'm saying that wrong. It removes state-level criminal penalties on the use and cultivation of marijuana by patients who possess a written or oral recommendation from their physician that he or she would, quote, benefit from medical marijuana. And this can include a lot of different types of illnesses. For example, multiple sclerosis, cancer, glaucoma. It's, the one we always hear about. It gets joked about a lot, but obviously if you have glaucoma, it's not a laughing matter. But a lot of times in these medical marijuana laws, in the actual statutory language, you'll see something like what's at the bottom of the screen there, other chronic or persistent medical symptoms. That could be lots of different things, right? So sometimes there's just sort of this catch-all phrase, and a physician who's of a mind to allow or to recommend that somebody use marijuana could buy it for virtually any type of condition or illness, including stress or Any number of things. And the thing here is that, and it's important to know, and I'm going to talk about this here in a minute in a little bit more detail, that doctors cannot prescribe marijuana. There is no law that allows a doctor to prescribe marijuana, and I'm going to explain why in a minute. But they can recommend it. In California, it doesn't have to even be in writing. It can be an oral recommendation from a physician. Now, to give you an example of what's out there, I'm going to talk about Minnesota and New York just for a moment, because when we get the first handful of medical marijuana laws that were passed in different states, California being the first, you saw some loopholes the employers and others have used to try to protect their right to maintaining a drug-free workplace. And you're starting to see a lot of that be addressed in these new bills that are being introduced. And Minnesota and New York are good examples of how the pro-marijuana people have gotten a lot smarter about this from a sort of a legal and political standpoint. So in Minnesota's law, it says restrictions on marijuana use related to the workplace, and there's a bunch right here. This is all good news, operating, navigating, or being in physical control of a motor vehicle, et cetera, et cetera. That's all good news. You're going to have this slide. You can go through it in detail. But also, employer from discriminating against a person in hiring, termination, or any term or condition of employment, or penalize a person if discrimination is based upon, one, the person being a registered medical marijuana patient, or a patient's positive drug test for cannabis components or metabolites, unless the patient used, possessed, or was impaired by medical cannabis on the premises of the place of employment or during the hours of employment. That is a tremendous, 400-foot brick wall right there for employers, because they long ago ruled that drug test result does not prove impairment. And so just because somebody tests positive is not grounds for an employer to say that individual was impaired in the workplace, even though they were a registered medical marijuana user. I can terminate them. In Minnesota, you're going to see this in other legislation introduced around the country. In Minnesota, you cannot use that positive drug test result solely as or justification for terminating somebody for a positive drug test. Now you got to go into the Minnesota drug testing law to find out what recourse you do have, and that would be a fascinating topic for another webinar. But there are things that you can do to protect yourself. In New York, they get one step further. Look at the second bullet. Employers are prohibited from taking disciplinary action against employees simply because of their lawful use of marijuana. Employees lawfully using medical marijuana are considered to have a disability under the New York Human Rights Law. Employers are required to consider making workplace accommodations for those who lawfully use medical marijuana. Why is this so important? Well, because we know that in Colorado, this network was sued by a registered medical marijuana user who tested positive and was terminated, and they were sued based on Colorado lawful activity statute, which basically said that you cannot discriminate against an employee for participates in an otherwise lawful activity, like smoking cigarettes, for example. Well, in the particular case, Coates v. Dish Network tried to use that lawful activity statute as the reason why Mr. Coates should not have been terminated after he tested positive, and before Colorado legalized marijuana for recreational use, but after they had legalized it for medicinal use. The Supreme Court of the state of Colorado got involved in this, and eventually, in fact, this came out earlier this year, and basically said, all are tied. You can't create a state law that contradicts a federal law, and under federal law, marijuana is still illegal. Therefore, we can't apply the lawful activity statute in the state of Colorado and allow Mr. Coates to have his job back or to force Dish Network to compensate him, et cetera. But the other problem with the New York medical law, which is it now states that marijuana, the lawfully used medical marijuana are considered to have a disability. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, which applies to the whole country, current alcohol abusers are protected. They are a protected class under the ADA. Current illicit drug users are not. So in other words, under the ADA, a medical marijuana user doesn't have protection because under federal law, marijuana is still considered an illegal drug. Take that a step further, and as designated a medical marijuana user as having a disability, it was contrary to the ADA, and allow them certain protections and rights under the New York human rights law. So you see two challenges that have been successfully argued in employers' favors, in employers' in other states, being here by the New York medical marijuana law. This is the model that we will see in states going forward. And I'm going to just kind of skip a couple of these. And now let's get to how to address marijuana in your drug testing policy, whether you're advising clients because you're a drug testing provider, or whether you're a drug testing buyer, a consumer of drug testing services. It is important to remember as we launch into the whole subject of your policy and how to address it from a policy standpoint. Marijuana is illegal under federal law. Why? Because it is still a Schedule I controlled substance under the Controlled Substances Act. Schedule I drug, we're talking about heroin, cocaine, and marijuana, among others, are just those with no currently accepted medical use and high potential for abuse, which means that it cannot be legally prescribed by a doctor. All the drugs that are Schedule I category controlled substances under federal law can be prescribed by a doctor because under federal law, there is no recognized accepted medical use for that drug. And there's high potential for abuse and, as an extension of that, addiction and the other problems that go along with that. That's the key to understanding how to address this issue from a policy perspective. You're still going to have to comply with the state laws on medical marijuana, et cetera. Your place of strength on this issue as an employer is the fact that it is illegal under federal law. That's what Dish Network hung its entire case on in the Coates v. Dish Network case in Colorado, and on using that. Now, there are employers who have federal contracts. They could be contractors, grantees, licensees, subject to the Drug-Free Workplace Act of 1988. They are required under that act to have a fitness for duty program, which requires them to maintain a drug-free workplace program. It doesn't always include and rarely requires testing for controlled substances, but it can. It does not prohibit that. There are, in addition to the Drug-Free Workplace Act requirements, OSHA regulations that actually impose liability on employers when they fail to provide a safe work environment under certain conditions. And that can include prohibiting employees from being at work impaired or in a state of impairment. And then, of course, many of you are familiar with the Department of Transportation federal drug and alcohol testing regulations. They require drug and alcohol testing of safety-sensitive workers in the transportation industry. It's very detailed, and there are specific requirements of how to test, and which drugs to test for, which includes marijuana. And all of those DOT regulations, whether you're talking about the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, the Federal Aviation, Federal Railroad, et cetera, all are testing for marijuana. So, employers this is what you can do. You prohibit possession, use of, or impairment by marijuana in the workplace. I'm going to come back to that word impairment, right, because that's a little bit of a sticking point. I'll come back to that. You test when you are required under the DOT regulations to drug testing. You must do so in compliance specifically and completely with those drug testing requirements. You can, under your own authority as a company, you don't have to be mandated by a federal agency to do it, and the right to discipline or terminate individuals who violate your company drug and alcohol testing policy when they test positive. Now, things that you can do. What you can't do, very simply, and I don't even have a slide on it, is you can't simply defy the legal marijuana law in your state. If you have certain conditions that have extended to medical marijuana users, for example, and like it in Minnesota, they have specifically brought it to the workplace with language that is specific to how an employer may handle medical marijuana users and not discriminate against them, et cetera. You must comply with those laws. And that can be written into your policy in such a way not only protects you as the employer, but also makes it possible for you to comply with the law while not giving up your position on maintaining a drug-free workplace. Now, I threw it in here because they kind of comply, excuse me, I just put this one slide here to make sure, just as a reminder to me, that we talked about Coates v. Dish Network and also Casillas versus Walmart in the state of Michigan. We don't need to take time on the Walmart case. We have already talked about the Dish Network case. They're significant, though, because they factor in how you address this issue from a policy standpoint. So, jump into the policy, okay? Policies for a living for many years, more years than I'm going to admit on this call. There are some basic rules that apply no matter what we're talking about. If we were talking about how to address alcohol in your drug testing policy, if we were talking about how to address synthetic drugs in your policy, some things would be consistent and universal from policy to policy regardless of the issue. But they apply to marijuana. Be clear. Be clear what your company policy says regarding prohibited behavior, how you do drug testing, and consequences for policy violations. And let me explain this. Let me pause here for a moment to explain this. Prohibited behavior and the consequences for policy violations are completely tied together, but connected through drug testing. So at the top, prohibited behavior are the things that you specifically prohibit employees from doing. They bring drugs into the workplace. They may not use drugs at the workplace. They may not cheat on a drug test or tamper with a sample or all these types of things. But if you have a policy for a company, what I almost never see, and every single time add to a policy, is they may not test positive for any drugs listed in this policy that we test for. Will include, and this is commonly referred to as your drug test panel, which will include marijuana. Prohibited behaviors that should be articulated in your policy that employees, job applicants may not test positive. Plain and simple. Consequences for testing positive, which is a violation of your policy because it's right there in your policy. You may not test positive. If a consequence is that you don't get hired, or you may be suspended. You're required to go through some type of employee paid for treatment or counseling program, or may be terminated depending on the law of the state that applies to you or the laws that apply to you. And connected through drug testing because you have to articulate in your policy that these are the drugs that we test for. We marijuana, cocaine, amphetamines, opiates, PCP, and all the others, the extended panels, the oxys and the hydros, etc. We test for these drugs. We test for them. This is where we test for them. This is what we do when a positive drug test result comes up, MRO, verification, et cetera, And the consequences for policy violations is X, Y, and Z. These things must be articulated in writing your policy, and furthermore, they must be communicated to your employees and to your job applicants, to your supervisors and managers in such a way that it's clear that they were given this information and they chose to ignore it and violate the company policy. And it's where you put in marijuana. Now, let me address the issue of impairment. I think I have a slide coming up, but yeah, it's actually the third bullet down. So, define under the influence means. So, under your prohibited behavior section of your policy, in addition to testing positive, you're also going to prohibit individuals from being at work under the influence. Under the influence is how you define it. It doesn't necessarily fall under the definition of impairment. It's something different, and we don't want to necessarily hang out on the word impairment because the courts have ruled that drug test results prove impairment, even though you and I both know that there are some state laws with statutory language that uses the word impairment or impaired. But we're going to define under the influence as, among other things, you know, you can think of the obvious ones, right? Smell like marijuana, uneven gait, slurred speaking ability, et cetera, et cetera. But we're also going to include in the definition of under the influence as a positive drug test result that our company tests for. Now, an individual who tests positive by company policy is considered to be under the influence. We're going to try to define it any further than that. And that will include all the drugs that we test for, which will include, if you're doing this right, it's going to include marijuana. and detection of any amount of the drug that we test for is a violation of company policy. Of course, we're only going to be able to inform or be informed of the amounts of the drug that are beyond the cutoff levels. So we use scientifically accepted, maybe even legally required cutoff levels like those used in the DOT regulations in 4 CFR Part 40, and we're going to articulate that in our policy so that we're covered. We didn't make up these cutoff levels. These are the cutoff levels recommended by the federal government under the DOT regulations. They apply to literally hundreds of thousands of employers around the country. That's what we use as well. And somebody who tests positive has the amount of drug in their system by those cutoff levels, and you define it. Now, that's a lot of talking. I realize that, and I'm keeping an eye on the clock because we're coming in for a landing here. But I need to take you through the 3 basic components of the language in addressing marijuana in your policy. Keep in mind, and stress this, okay? You can't take what I'm about to give you and just insert it into your policy and think that you've got a marijuana section in your policy. You can do that, but key to a good policy is to do things with the language. 1, make that it is in line with your drug testing objectives as a corporation. And 2, definitely, 100% of the time, make sure it complies with the drug testing laws that apply to you. If you're in one state, you maybe have it easy. But if you're in 50 states, you're going to have to add addendum language to your policy that covers the varying requirements from state to state to state. So that state-by-state basis, your company is operating in compliance with the laws that apply to it. I get asked this question all the time because drug testing policies, that's our core business. If I state which law applies to me, my headquarters state or what? Answer is, how many states are you in? 36? 36 laws apply to you. And that's not the answer that most employers want to hear, but it's not that challenging to address it on a state-by-state basis. Look for the common requirements from state to state to state, and then just add to your policy on an addendum basis, state-by-state addendum basis, those requirements that are different. Excuse me. So, the base of the policy. The company recognizes state laws permit the use of marijuana either for medical or recreational purposes. However, the federal government continues to classify marijuana as a Schedule I controlled substance, thus making it legal to use for any purpose under federal law. That's the basis. Remember, we talked about that in the Coates v. Dish Network case that the Colorado Supreme Court ruled on. The basis that you're going to build around when you add this marijuana language or a marijuana section to your policy. Again, don't use language, word for word. And they're going to discuss prohibited conduct. Employees are prohibited from being under the influence of marijuana while at work or any time as exhibited by a positive drug test result. Remember, I'm going to put that in there specifically. And they're prohibited from bringing marijuana or any marijuana-related paraphernalia to work or using marijuana while at work, including lunch breaks and other time off during an official work schedule. They may not use marijuana or be under the influence of marijuana at any time that they're representing your company. We could take this a step further, right? We could talk about entertaining clients or being at a off-site event or while traveling for the company, etc. I get asked this question a lot as well. In my state, marijuana is not legal. However, my employees are traveling to Colorado for a conference, and what happens if they smoke marijuana while they're in Colorado? Well, Colorado law, they can, people visiting from other states can smoke marijuana and the police aren't going to do anything to them. But under your company policy, you can prohibit them from using marijuana while traveling on behalf of the company and hold them responsible for their behavior when they are under the influence of marijuana, even in a state where marijuana use is legal, because they're not residents of that state, your company is not domiciled in that state, etc. A lot more to it than that. But the point is that prohibited conduct section of this 3-4 paragraph section on marijuana, you want to make sure that employees are prohibited from being under the influence of marijuana while at work, which includes a positive drug test result. We talked about that in detail. And now finally, consequences. Employees who test positive for marijuana, regardless of the reason for the use or the source from which the employee acquired the drug, will be considered in violation of this policy and subject to possible adverse employment action as outlined in the consequences section of this policy. And I refer to the consequences section of the policy here because typically you're going to have a detailed and perhaps a lengthy consequences section that's placed in your policy. This is not your consequences section, what you see on the screen in front of you. This is consequence language associated with marijuana that's going to be in your marijuana section. But you're going to refer the reader to the consequences section, just like you're going to refer the reader on the previous slide to the prohibited conduct section as well, so they can get more detail on other prohibited conduct. This is what you want to make sure you have in your policy. So, if we're in the room together, I would ask at this point before I conclude, are there any questions? And likely, the questions I'm going to get is, well, what happens if I'm in state marijuana laws and states without legal marijuana laws? And if you see there, if you go down to about the fourth bullet, if you are located in some states with legal marijuana laws and some without, you are required to impose legal marijuana standards in the states without such laws. So if you're in Colorado and Idaho, you're required to allow your Idaho employees to any privileges that are associated with your employees in Colorado where marijuana is legal. You know that. And your employees have to understand that as well. They can't go to Colorado and legally purchase marijuana and then come back to Idaho and think that they can legally use it in Idaho. That's not the case. You're mandated by the federal government to conduct drug testing. You must test for marijuana. I'm familiar with, although there may be a regulation out there that I'm just plain not familiar with. We mostly deal with DOT regulations. I'm not familiar with the federal regulation that does not include marijuana in the drug test panel. If it exists, then you comply with it. But if you fall under the DOT regulations, you must continue to test for marijuana. If you're mandated by a state government agency of any kind, you must likely test for marijuana. I'll give you a good example. In Illinois, there is no mandatory drug testing law in the state of Illinois. However, there is a mandatory law that applies to public works contractors who do business with the state of Illinois in doing like road construction, things of that nature, public works. A separate law that applies to their industry, and they must test for marijuana under that specific law that applies to them. It is in states without legal marijuana laws. The legal marijuana laws in other states do not apply to you. Don't get nervous if you're in, again, say Idaho or Wyoming or Montana, just because it's legalized in the states all around you. And not the fourth bullet, let me go below that. If you are located in a state with a medical marijuana law, check the law to make sure that you're in compliance with that law. If you're in Alaska, Colorado, Oregon, or Washington, you still comply with DOT regulations that require testing for marijuana. Just because it's been legalized in those states does not mean that you don't have to test for marijuana. You must test for marijuana. And then regardless of where your business is located, marijuana is still illegal under the law. Now, pause, take some questions here. And I'm going to pause on this AWSI page right here so that you can get their contact information if you'd like more information about the services that they provide. I will tell you this, that I've shared with you some of the most common questions that I get asked. But one of the questions I get asked is, what can I as an employer do about this issue? And what I always tell them is that, the only thing that, if you're against legalizing marijuana, I realize some people in the drug testing business may be ambivalent on it or they may be in favor of it. We come from all kinds of backgrounds. But where you're against legalization of marijuana, the most important thing you can do is contact your local chamber of commerce or your state chamber of commerce and find out what they're doing to this issue and to make sure that they are addressing the issue. Because this will definitely have an impact on business going forward. On the drug testing industry, I think yes. On industry in general, absolutely, no question about it. And one of the surveys that we do every year is an international drug testing survey. And we just presented the results last month at the National Forum on Drug and Alcohol Testing, the IFDAC conference, which was held in San Diego this year. And the question we asked is, what is the legalization of marijuana in the countries where you do business, what impact is it having on your company? And we found is that many international companies don't deal with this issue. I mean, legalizing marijuana is not on the radar screen in any of the countries where they do business. Their biggest fear that the legalization effort in the United States is going to spread across the oceans in countries where they do business. So they're watching what happens here very carefully because they're afraid that this trend in the U.S., this lenient, lax trend toward marijuana, is going to find its way into their countries, and that's their biggest concern. Right now, they don't deal with the legalization issue in the same way that you employers deal with this problem. Okay, we have a couple of questions beyond that. Well, and these are some technical things, but absolutely, yes, you are going to get these slides, and Jessica's going to explain how that's going to work here in a minute when I turn the mic back over to her. Here's a question. Is there any legal issue with employers in states where it is legal to still ban it in the workplace? And I kind of addressed that, but you know, the issue there is that you're required to comply with the law that applies to, you know, in the states where you're at. So again, if you're in multiple states, you may find yourself in a position where you have to comply with a state law that has legalized marijuana. Say you're in Michigan, but you're also in Indiana. Indiana has not legalized marijuana. Ohio has not legalized marijuana. That's a better example because of their just recent vote. But in Michigan, the medical marijuana, and there have been some recent legal developments in Michigan that have gone a step further than in some states to protect the rights of marijuana users. Question: thought that federal law supersedes state laws, allowing the employer to discipline the employee who tests positive. Yes, and the answer to that question is yes. We found that to be true in Colorado, and that's what the Colorado Supreme Court based its decision on, was the fact that under federal law, marijuana is still illegal, and they could not rule in favor of a state law that contradicted a federal law. So you are absolutely right on that question, on that statement. That's not going to stop people from challenging the law. And we do know that the federal government the Department of Justice has a statement out where they indicate that they're not going to try to enforce the law in some of the states that have legalized marijuana. That may seem counterintuitive, of course, but they're going to go after illegal drug use, which is the drug use that still takes place among drug dealers and that is facilitated by drug dealers and things of that nature, and some other specific circumstances. That, of course, complicates the situation, doesn't it? Because it places a federal law in federal law enforcement in contradiction with local laws. And last question, let me squeeze this in because I know I got to turn it over to Jessica. Would you put the marijuana section in your policy or in the addendum section regarding the state laws? I put it right there at the top of the policy. Start a policy with a purpose statement, with the application, who it applies to, who has authority to enforce the policy. Then typically it'll be one of the next one or two sections after the beginning of the policy where we'll place the marijuana section. Right there at the top, you want to make your statement very clear. You may refer to marijuana at different places in the policy itself, but we like to put it right there at the top and put it front and center so that there can be no confusion later on as to whether or not we address the issue. Lots of other questions, I'm sure. I apologize that I can't get to all of them. We're out of time. Thank you for joining today's call. I'm going to turn the virtual microphone over to Jessica at this point, who will give you more information about how to access today's slides and recording. But again, thank you to AWSI for sponsoring today's webinar presentation. Jessica?
And on behalf of AWSI, we want to thank you for your participation in today's webinar, and we hope that you have found today's presentation informative and helpful. This presentation was recorded, and you will receive instructions via email informing you how to access the recording. Thank you for your attendance today. This concludes today's webinar.